Good evening. I hope you can all hear that. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Rushcliffe Borough Council's Growth and Development Scrutiny Group, and literally a warm welcome. It's lovely weather outside. I would just like to remind everybody that this is being live streamed on YouTube, just so you're aware if you've got your hair brushed properly, etc. So it is being live streamed, so you are on candid camera. Also, under the local authorities regulations, people can film or record proceedings. So just to let you know that if they do, the Borough Council has absolutely no control over that. So we just have to accept the consequences of that. However, on a slightly more pleasant note, I'd like to welcome we do have quite a few visitors to contribute to our discussions, so you're all very welcome. We have Chris Carter and Paul Horn from Nottingham City Council. We've got Sean Parks from the County Council. We've got Hugh McClintock from Pedals, and we've got Claire Maltby from Sustrans. So they will all be contributing to the various debates as we proceed, or our two debates, shall we say. So with that bit of house, please do what I've just done. I've just remembered to put my mobile phone on silent. So if you could all please remember to do that, so it will be very helpful indeed. And so let's get on to the agenda proper. Item 1, apologies for absence.
We have apologies from Councillor Barney, and we have Councillor Maureen Stockwood as a substitute this evening.
Thank you very much. I noticed that Councillor Cotty is not here. I suspect it. Oh, no, it's not working. I suspect it's because I did actually ring Councillor Butler and warn him that there was a lorry stuck under Tollerton Bridge, and I hadn't realised in my mind that Councillor Cotty, of course, will be coming that way from Keyworth. I suspect he's stuck in the queue for the railway bridge, so hopefully he'll be arriving at some stage. Item 2, declarations of interest. I'd like to just declare, although it's not really a declaration of interest because we're not making any actual decisions, but I am chairman of the Transport and Environment Committee at Nottinghamshire County Council, which obviously does include cycling, but I don't believe that I have a conflict because we're not actually making any decisions to spend any money or any policy decisions. They will be merely recommendations to other internal bodies. So I'm very comfortable that I don't have a conflict because we'll be using different roles within that. But I just wanted to be open and transparent and let you know that. Any other declarations of interest? Councillor Butler?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think rather along similar lines to yourself, although I'm not involved on any committee or decision-making process at the County Council on this sort of subject, but in terms of transparency, I just thought I ought to put it on record my County Council interest. Thank you. Involved.
Thank you. Welcome. Good evening, Councillor Cotty. I suspect
yes,
you were caught in a queue. You were caught in a queue.
Yes, I enjoyed queuing, Chairman. Thank you.
I
turned around and went back to Plumtree actually and came through.
I need to apologise to you because I rang Councillor Butler to tell him, and I have to confess I forgot that you might be involved as well. So
I'll make a note of that. Yeah. So yeah, and I've got the same as Councillor Butler, declaring an interest from the County Council side. Yeah, so thank you, and apologies for being late.
Great, lovely. Okay, thank you. Any other declarations of interest? No. Okay, so let's proceed on item 3, minutes of the meeting held on 21st of April. May I sign those as a true and correct record? Got somebody proposed, seconded. Yeah, any all in favour, or those who were here? I think for those who are here, I think we're okay. So that's fine. Thank you very much. So on to the substantive items. And item 4 is the River Trent footbridge, which will certainly be very interesting. And I'll ask Catherine Evans, would you just like to start the report off, please?
Good evening. I'm standing in for Andrew Pegram, our Service Manager for Planning, as he's unable to attend this evening. Hopefully you've all had a chance to have a read of the report that covers the proposed location and appearance, the justification and benefits, the impact, the consenting process, including planning, and then the timescales for the bridge. And as you'll all have seen, the recommendations are note that the Growth and Development Scrutiny Group note the contents of the report and presentation to the group, support the principle of a new pedestrian and cycle bridge over the River Trent, and provide comments on the proposals to be included in the response to the consultation exercise. So as Councillor Clark mentioned, we've got Paul and Chris here from the City Council, so I'll hand over to them to do their presentation.
Great. So yeah, we have Chris Carter and Paul Horn. It's over to you, gentlemen, whoever wants to start the proceedings.
Yes, good evening. My name is Chris Carter. I'm the Head of Transport Strategy for Nottingham City Council. I am the programme lead for the Transforming Cities programme, of which the proposed new pedestrian cycle bridge forms part. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the strategic background to the scheme and where it sits within the wider Transforming Cities programme. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Paul, who is the project manager, who is going to talk to you more specifically about the scheme, in particular its location and the programme for its development. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Just to give a bit of wider context, the walking and cycling schemes actually are being developed within a sort of wider plan, something called a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. This is something that the government is encouraging areas to do. Sort of uniquely in this area, we're developing this in partnership with the 2 cities and 2 counties are working together within the D2N2 LEP area to develop a LEP-wide programme. So hopefully that shows an element of joined upness along boundaries, because obviously people do cross our boundaries in this area. So it's important that the authorities work together. The area obviously is a very large area, and that's actually being developed into these sort of 3 sub-areas. So obviously the area that we're most interested in here is the Derby, Nottingham and local urban connections part of the plan, and the bridge sits within that, along with other proposed route improvements, and I think we'll link into particularly what Sean is going to talk to you about in the later presentation. So if you see it within that context, I think it's helpful to understand that. Those plans are still being developed. I think they're at a fairly advanced stage, and they are at the public consultation stage. So that's something that to be aware of as well. So people can also input into the development of the wider plans. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the Transforming Cities programme itself, the Transforming Cities programme is something that we were invited to bid for by the government. It was open to mainly to urban areas, particularly to encourage commuting and other uptake of particularly sustainable transport. It primarily covers walking and cycling projects and public transport projects. Nottingham and Derby basically worked together on this programme because both to look at improving those connections within the 2 urban areas, but also looking at that area in between. There's a lot of development that's taking place between the existing areas, particularly around sort of East Midlands Airport area and the regeneration areas around that. So it also includes connections to those areas. So we've also worked with obviously with our neighbouring counties, and there are measures that go beyond the urban areas, and there are schemes being delivered within the county areas as part of this programme as well. So it's not just within the Nottingham and Derby areas themselves. Specifically for walking and cycling, there's £40 million within a £160 million programme that we've been awarded that is going towards cycling and walking. Specifically in for Nottingham, and sorry, there's 40 million that's been allocated to walking and cycling within the urban areas, and 9 million has been allocated specifically to the bridge and the associated connections to it, and that's been ring fenced for this programme. And then basically, in terms of deadlines, we have to at least have committed this money by March 23. That means that there may still be construction work carrying on beyond that, but we have to have basically decided what we're doing and substantially committed the money by March 23. Next slide, please. So that plan basically shows the schemes that we will be improving as part of the overall £40 million programme. So you can see there are both routes within the urban area and routes out, particularly to the south towards Clifton and beyond, heading out towards East Midlands Airport, also picking up the campus at Sutton Bonington, and then there's a route to a longer distance route towards Derby, and then there are routes within the urban area, and obviously the river crossing, which is what we're specifically talking about tonight. So you can just see there that it is part of a much wider programme. Okay, next slide. And just finally for me, just in terms of the governance, there is a sort of a joint board that is covering the Nottingham and Derby area for the whole programme, which and then there's a separate steering group looking at the development of the new bridge itself. Participants in the bridge programme are the County Council, Rushcliffe are involved in it, Environment Agency, Canal and River Trust and the City Council. And that identifies the roles of myself as the overall programme lead, and also Paul, who is the project manager for the scheme. We also have Amy Consulting, who are assisting with the design of the scheme, and we'll also be appointing a principal contractor to actually construct that, but they haven't been appointed yet. I'm now going to hand over to Paul to talk about the specifics of the scheme.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Good evening, everyone. So I've got more pictures and plans, so there's not too many words, so don't worry. I thought we'd start by just looking, and I'm sure you're all incredibly familiar with the existing bridge provision that we've got that pedestrians and cyclists can use in the area. So number 1 is Wilford Toll Bridge, 2 is the Suspension Bridge, 3 we've got Trent Bridge, and 4 is Lady Bay Bridge. Now all have got accessibility for pedestrians and cyclists, some better than others and more accessible in terms of their routes. I put the red blob on the right hand side, that circle linking between Home Pierpont and Colwick Park, as an option that was looked at previously in terms of trying to put a bridge connection over. We ran into issues with Environment Agency at the time, so that's not something that we've sort of focused any further attention on. The green area, the green circle rather, is the area that we're currently looking at for the new bridge location. So as you see, it complements bridges 1 to 4. We'll come on to that later. It provides a new bridge location which serves quite a lot of important connections in the city. So if we can just go on to, and obviously connecting from Rushcliffe and West Bridgeford to the south. You can just go on to the next slide, please. We're just here with the sort of shaded area shows the Waterside redevelopment area within Nottingham, and the red line shows the SPD areas, supplementary plan development area for the Waterside. And obviously this is quite a substantial development for the city in terms of new homes, residents, connections, schools and the like. And there's clearly an intention to improve the connectivity both into the city centre, out towards the east, and also to the south as well. So to enable all sorts of movements via all sorts of different sustainable modes. Next slide, please. So here we're just graphically showing the location before. That sort of green circle that we had allows connectivity from West Bridgeford and all routes from the south over into the north, and then onwards into the city centre via the the huge development in the island site. It's actually quite a decent route in, cycling and walking in that way as well, and it will be improved massively over the coming years. We've improved in the last few years the cycle route along Bowstring Road. You're probably familiar with the horses on the roundabout there by the race course, and that cycle route connects further east towards Gedling as well. So in terms of commuter routes, the new bridge does offer access into the new Waterside regeneration area and then backwards, obviously down south. And it also provides onwards connections into the city and obviously to the Gedling development areas out towards the east. Next slide, please. It's not all about commuting routes, and not everybody works in the city centre. So the bridge opens up and offers new leisure connections, specifically over towards Collick Park, towards the east there. The park run's very popular there, and currently, in order for people from kind of West Bridgeford area to get to the park run, it's not an easy place to go to. The bridge, just an example, will open up really improved connections for quite a lot of people there. So it just it's not all about commuting. I think it is what we're trying to say about the bridge. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned the previous 4 bridges that we've got, on the 5th one, the site that we're looking at. Apologies for the, I think I'd rather a wavy hand when I was drawing this slide, but it's slightly Picasso-esque, and I've done a bit of a lasso on the right-hand side. But just to get to the point across that one bridge on its own is great, but if you put it with other bridges, you open up leisure routes and loops and circuits. And people have been out and about lots more in the last year. So we've not had a great year, but people have been out exploring their local area, you know, in huge numbers, and people are kind of very keen to rather than walk in the same route, to offer up loops and circuits. And the bridge, a new bridge, would certainly add into that. So it opens up connectivity, but it also opens up different leisure. And again, we're not exactly sure how these are going to pan out, but there's triathlon clubs that are very interested as well. So it opens up quite a lot of benefits in terms of, you know, kind of leisure route connectivity. Next slide, please. And also access to sports ground. I mean, we're very blessed, as you're all very familiar with, the sports grounds that we've got: Nottingham Forest, Notts County, the cricket ground, but also Nottingham Rugby Club. And a new bridge offers improved connectivity to all of those sports grounds, and obviously for spectators, and it eases up some of the existing bridge traffic routes that we've got as well. So it's important to mention it's not just about commuting, it offers up a wealth of connectivity. The next slide, please. So this slide shows how the bridge location sits in. So we've got 3, just about make out 3 red lines connecting over the bridge. This shows the existing routes, which are in red. So they're existing off-road carriageway routes. Existing routes, on-road connections, are in blue. The existing routes that we're looking to review are in black. So they are the routes that we would look to try and either improve, and it might be small scale improvements, might be signage, might be lighting, might be new paths. So there's a whole host of potential improvements that we could make. So I think the key point that we want to get across is it's not just about the bridge itself, it's how the bridge ties in and becomes part of a wider network. That's the key part of the message. So the £9 million isn't solely towards the bridge, it's to deliver wider connectivity and improve routes as well. So that's what that slide's trying to get across. Next slide, please. So we tasked Amy to look at 3 potential bridge locations over the Trent, and we're looking to orientate yourself. Lady Bay Bridge is to the left of the slide, and just to the sort of green area is the sports pitches and the Boots Sports Ground and the Forest, Notts County training pitches to the south. Looking over towards the north of the river, that's a whole development area. You can pick out the Trent Basin area. So one of the options on the right towards the east would be connecting at the bottom of Trent Lane. The top of Trent Lane is the roundabout on Dowside Road, which serves the oldie Smith Toy Superstore, that Lady Bay retail part there. The middle bridge location would land directly onto Trent Basin itself, and the bridge location to the east sits to the bottom of Poulton Drive, again connecting onto Dowside Road. So all kind of very similar in terms of their location, but each have got specific pros and cons in terms of their deliverability. Next slide, please. So I've got a few pictures. This one's looking obviously from the south bank over towards the north bank, looking towards the Trent Lane location. So that's the location to the east on the previous slide, the far right. Here we've got existing built out developments, and as you can see, developments under construction on to the far right of the picture. It's quite constrained, the area at the bottom of that site. There's also a storm overflow. So we've asked Amy to look at all these options, and they've provided initial assessments report, and this was kind of coming out as quite difficult to do. So we've switched focus to the other two for now. Next slide, please. This is looking over from Trent Lane back towards the Hooks fields. You've got the Forest training ground behind the trees to the right of the picture. Next slide, please. This is looking from the built out section of Trent Basin over towards the new part that's about to be redeveloped, and this is a potential landing spot for the bridge. So old industrial area and right for kind of improving accessibility homes and then opening up potentially to wider accessibility. Next slide, please. So this is looking back from the south towards the same location, looking towards the north of the river, and there's the built out apartment block on the right hand side there. Next slide, please. This shows the path on the south bank, which I'm sure you're excuse me, familiar with. It's feels quite constrained at times, especially in summer months when the leaves are in, the trees are in full leaf, the vegetation's growing in from the bank. And in the winter time, as you can see on the right hand side, the path just becomes incredibly muddy, churned up quite a lot over the winter period when a lot of people are out and about walking, cycling more than ever. The picture on the right is looking towards Lady Bay Bridge. So we're looking at options to excuse me, work with the sports ground, see if we can look to move the fences back into the tree line to help widen it out, not only to provide more space, but to provide a sense of openness, and perceptions of security are quite important as well. We could potentially light this stretch. Again, these are all options that we're considering as well. Next slide, please. If you think back to the three options that we had, the central option, Trent Basin, lands, excuse me, to the south here, and in between the Boots Sports Ground, the rugby club pitches, and cricket training pitches, and in this photo we're seeing the football training pitches. The area of land in between, where it's sort of shrubs and trees, it's a potential to put a new route in there, and that would then connect up to the car park at the Hook. So that's something that we're considering as well. We've had initial discussions with the sports grounds who are open to discussions to proceed. Next slide, please. This is an early option that was put together by Amy for a Bowstring Archbridge that would land at Poulton Drive, and it highlights some of the issues that we've got to contend with in the bridge design. Is the navigable height, so that watercraft can pass underneath the bridge, and also the higher the bridge, the longer the ramps, and the more impact on the floodplain. So those are some of the issues that we're currently wrestling with. We've appointed consultants to provide flood modelling assessments, flood modelling reports, but this shows one of the early options that we're putting together for Poulton Drive. Next slide, please. This option shows, again, quite early days, but it's a bowstring arch constructed bridge. A cable stay bridge is an option as well and the option for Poulton Drive, but it wouldn't work at the Trent Basin location. Next slide, please. A lot of our time recently has been spent trying to work out how we could get the scheme to sit on the North Bank and integrate with the proposed development, and simultaneously open up the basin area for activity whilst trying to integrate it into the housing development as well. So we can see the bridge coming in over the Trent to the bottom of the slide. The bridge is proposed to have an effective width of 3.5 metres. And then we've got ramps coming down off the bridge on this north bank. To the right-hand side, that's going over the mouth of the basin. So the ramp down also provides a bridge over the head of the basin, and that provides the connectivity for the east-west route along the Riverside path. And the remainder of the Riverside path is due to be built out over the coming years as the development parcels of land are taken forward. Excuse me. So the option that we've got here, again, we're working it through with the landowners there, but the option that Amy put together here shows a kind of amphitheatre style seating arrangement. So it raises the whole area up in terms of public realm integration. There's also steps down. The ramps are accessible. It's 1 in 25, I think, ramp gradient to the east. This option's got 1 in 15 with risers to the west, but there is an option for a 1 in 20. It just extends the ramp slightly further. But it's just to give you a flavour of the design constraints that we're working with and how we're trying to make the bridge as usable as possible, really, in terms of trying to have reduced lengths of ramps and so that people can access easily. Next slide, please. Again, this one's showing a view, quite a slightly odd view. Imagine yourself sat in the bottom of Trent Basin. I'm not sure you quite want to do that, but you can picture yourself sat there. We're looking through towards that, we're calling it that amphitheatre style arrangement. To the right hand side, you just about make out there's a proposed apartment block there. Excuse me. And we can see the ramps coming down, and then the ramps to the right hand side, it's a ramp / bridge that goes over the head of the basin there. So again, we're working these designs up further, working with the landowner and structural colleagues and highways colleagues and a whole host of people to try and work these up to a point that we can then consult with everyone on the options that we've got together. Next slide, please. Excuse me, I'll just have another drink. So, a quick run through the programme. We're looking at a technical assessment of the 3 options. So, we're actually extended that slightly because of the kind of iterative development on the North Bank. We've got a raft of ecological surveys that are happening over the summer months. The flood modelling assessment work is ongoing. The base model's been built, and then we'll start testing the scenarios a few weeks' time. Excuse me, that's absolutely critical. Public exhibition, we're looking at September, October time. That's when we're targeting the dates for those. So there'll be a mixture of online and face-to-face if we can at those times, depending on how the current climate is. We're targeting December might run into January, depends on the flood modelling and the various factors, to submit a planning application. And that would be to both the City Council and to Rushcliffe Borough Council, because it would be, because of the cross-boundary implications, it would be a duplicate application to both authorities. We're hopeful of a planning decision in spring, detailed design to follow through the summer, and targeting construction in the autumn. And this is purely for the excuse me, this is purely for the bridge. We may start to undertake some improvement works to certain paths in, say, the Collick Park area, which would stand alone even if we never did the bridge, but obviously make a lot of sense if we then manage to get the bridge through and constructed. We're hoping to get the bridge open in spring 23. But as Chris says, we've got it's March 23 where we've got a substantially either spent or committed a lot of the funding. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So as Chris said, we've got a really good steering group set up with colleagues from Rushcliffe County Council, Environment Agency, Carlton River Trust. It's working very well. We meet on a monthly basis to update the steering group members on the scheme design, and the steering group members also influence the thinking on the design as well, and input in terms of their approvals, the permits that we need to go through for the Environment Agency. So it's a really it's working really well, the steering group. It's really beneficial. Flood modelling I've mentioned, and we're awaiting in a few weeks' time the final report from Amy on the bridge locations, and then we'll start working up the design and aesthetics of the bridge for the planning submission. And I think that might be it.
Great.
And that's me. If you feel like emailing me through all that.
Your voice just didn't manage to survive.
So apologies for that.
Great, lovely. Right, thanks for that. So I think probably the best thing is if we open it up to questions from anybody. I just have you got a preferred location as at the moment?
I think we've got 3 locations on the go. I think we've recognised that the Trent Lane option is going to be very difficult. The construction of it is very constrained, so I think that's looking highly unlikely. We probably have a leaning towards the Trent Basin site, but there are still some constraints to be overcome, so that's sort of subject to some additional design work. The Polton Drive one is probably deliverable, but I think there are certain weaknesses of that site. It's closest to Lady Bay Bridge, for example, so I think we prefer for certain factors the Trent Basin site, but we're having to complete the design work before we can be definitive on that.
Thank you. And apart from obviously thanking you for coming and advising us about it, presumably your 2 main ambitions this evening are to seek an in principle support, and also an indication of if there may be any planning issues or general comments in terms of access, etc. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, we're still, if you like, in absorbing information mode, so if people have got particular comments or things they would like to inform us of, that'll be helpful for us in the design process.
Great. I'll just one more question before I open this up to most important of all, are you asking Rushcliffe Borough Council for any money?
Not at this stage, certainly not for the construction.
What do you mean not at this stage?
In terms of actually constructing the bridge, certainly not. I mean, there are ongoing maintenance issues that will have to be discussed in the fullness of time, but in terms of contributions to the development of the scheme and development of new paths, certainly not. All that money is secured.
Okay, right. So if I open it up to Councillor Phillips.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. So we can see that there's £9 million ring fence for the bridge. Have we got an idea of how much the current design would cost, and what happens if we go over that 9 million? Where does the additional money come from? When we actually build the bridge, we need to make sure that there's a provision in there to stop illegal motorcyclists using it as a, you know, a bit of a rat run for drug runs or whatever they do, because we do have issues on good cycle paths, particularly alongside the tram path through Compton Acres. We put some barriers in there which has deterred the motorcyclists, but it's also hampered some families who want to use that path as well. So we need to sort of think about that in the design. One of my questions was, which Neil's already sort of mentioned, was, you know, do you want any money from Rushcliffe, and the ongoing maintenance side of things? You know, who will pick that up? Will it be 50% county, 50% city? You might not be able to give us that information at this moment in time. There's also £40 million there for cycle and pedestrian routes and things like that. Is that going to be shared across the county and the city? And who will make the decisions on where that money is spent? And I think that will do for now. Thank you.
If I just pick up on the cost of the bridge, so we're currently costing early days between sort of £5 and £7 million. The different options, believe it or not, have kind of up to 20 metres difference in span, so that's quite a lot of extra steel depending. So, and also we haven't really fixed the location or the design of the bridge quite yet, but as a guide, that's kind of where we are at the moment. Obviously we go down a kind of estimating funnel. The closer we get towards them, we refine those costs down. But that 9 million has to cover all the construction, all the design fees, all the surveys, planning fees, permits, you know, the whole shooting match. So it's got to cover everything. So the remainder out of that goes towards the immediate connecting routes, as I explained in the slide. So there's certainly money available to do those things. In terms of, I'll let Chris answer the one about the connectivity. In terms of the maintenance arrangements, slightly early days, but it's going to be a highway bridge. So we need to have discussions with the county in terms of the ongoing maintenance. Coming back to the sort of design issues, I mentioned that we're looking for an effective width of 3.5. So what I mean by that is we might have parapets slightly leaning in, but the gap in between would be 3.5 metres. So we wouldn't have, you know, a bridge deck and then everything else, and that actually becomes very constrained. So the effective usable width would be 3.5 metres. You're quite right that we need to start thinking about the design in terms of it's squaring that circle, which lots of authorities up and down the country have. And we're talking with our colleagues and experts in pedals and sustrans about how we can maintain accessibility whilst restricting use for others. We've also had questions about will horses start to use the bridge? Well, be an interesting one. So there's a whole host of users that it opens up. Effectively, we want to make the bridge as accessible as possible, but we don't want to encourage, you know, undesirable use, and that's a difficult one to achieve. But that comes slightly, I'm thinking we are aware of those issues, but the absolute detail comes a little bit further down the line. But there's a wealth of knowledge and experience out there that we can draw upon. I think that's the technical questions.
Just in terms of the 40 million that's allocated, the nature of the Transforming Cities programme was that we had to bid for specific schemes. So it's not, so the sum of all these schemes that were for walking and cycling is 40 million, but that is allocated to specific schemes, and they were shown on one of the plans that we showed earlier. So it is for that programme. Some of those schemes are in the county area, and we are working with the county on those. So it's a mixture really of within Nottingham, within Derby, also Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. So there is a mix of where those schemes are located.
Councillor Butler.
Thank you. Picking up on the finance again, the £9 million you mentioned, does that also include the ramps and the access to the actual bridge itself? And also regards to finance in general, I'm sure we're all old enough to remember and read things that happened in the past where we have these lovely schemes coming in, there's funding allocated, and we come up, these are designs and drawings, and then suddenly for some reason, when it's too late to sort of go back, you suddenly find, oh, we need X amount extra for something we hadn't quite thought of. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it has happened in the past. So how sure are we that the designs and all the work that's going into this will definitely fall within the budget that's been allocated, and you won't, and then you won't be coming back to us or whoever saying we suddenly realise we need a bit more funding. So it's just careful financial management.
I mean, I think Paul has answered this really by saying, you know, we've allocated 9 million to the programme overall. We expect the cost of the bridge to be in the region of 5 to 7 million. So you can see there's headroom within there. Obviously, if the bridge itself cost more, it means we probably would end up spending a bit less on the access routes, but that's how we would fund it. Also, this sits within a bigger budget programme of 160 million in total, and obviously it depends on how other projects are doing as well, but it is a big programme, so there is some flexibility if this particular item, and I would say that this item is probably one of the most highest profile, and it is a transforming cities programme, and this is one of the most transformational schemes, so I think it's pretty high up in the priority order. So it's certainly from our side, it's one that we want to prioritise and we want to deliver.
Right, any
Yes,
sorry,
away from finances, I may have just missed the design. You were talking about the amphitheatre steps. What's all that about then? I mean, are we going to be putting some little shows on, or sort of, or is it just a decoration? Or, I mean, are we expecting crowds of people to turn up and gather?
Tour of Britain.
Well, yeah, but just what's the thinking behind those?
A couple of reasons for that. One is obviously where we land the bridge over, we've got to deal with a change in height. So we could just have ramps down with sort of bare steel structure, but we're thinking we need to make more of a feature of it. So the steps are a way of building the land up to where the bridge lands, you know, on the north bank, and it creates a bit of a feature at the head of the basin. So then, you know, people can walk up and down there, congregate on the top. We'll put seating benches on the top of there, and people can have a look out over the river and back over the basin and around the whole area. So the idea, and it's not necessarily something that we're going to take forward, but it's one of the ideas that we're currently kind of working on, and it's one that, you know, we've discussed with a few colleagues internally. And it seems to be one that's sticking, and it seems to be grabbing people's attention. So it kind of hides some of the structure of the bridge, but also opens it up and opens up the views over the river, and it makes more of a feature ahead of the basin. So that's kind of the thinking of it. It's something, it's playable spaces. It's allowing people, you know, with young families or whoever, to sort of walk around and climb up and down, and it's activity in a variety of ways. So we think it might work quite well. There might be some reasons why we can't do it, but we're not quite, you know, we're testing the options at the moment. But it's something that seems to be generating a little bit of interest there. Yeah.
From a bit of a more practical point of view, in Rushcliffe, certainly we are quite rightly very protective of trees, and there are a lot of trees down there which I would suspect are sort of somewhere between 100 and 200 years old. I don't know, but they're pretty what I would call noble trees, pretty substantial trees. So are you able to design the bridge, or more importantly the access ramps, etc., so that the residents of Rushcliffe won't be losing any trees?
Yeah, there are some nice tree specimens down there, particularly opposite the sort of the Trent Lane option. If you think back to one of the photos where we were looking from the north bank back over to the south, there's some 9 or 10 quite prominent trees there. That's another reason why that location is perhaps least favoured. In terms of further along the bank there for the other two locations, there would be some vegetation and some limited tree loss during the construction, but we would always replant 2 for 1. And when we go back into the construction, it's difficult to say at this time. We're starting to think ahead towards construction and access routes. I'm not going to sit here and say we can wave a magic wand and land everything slap bang in the middle and leave all the trees. I think it'd be unrealistic to say that, but we would look to minimise vegetation and tree loss, and we would look to replant where we can.
So, well, that'll come out at the time of the planning application then, won't it? So, yeah. You mentioned river traffic. I think it's probably quite easy to ensure that motor cruisers can go underneath, but will you be able to satisfy the requirements of sailing dinghies as well?
The option that we're looking at for Trent Basin has a navigable height clearance for the Nottingham Princess cruisers. 7.3 masted sailing boats would have trouble getting underneath there. We've had initial discussions with the sailing club. We're due to meet them again next week. That is one of the issues that we're having to contend with. If we increase the height of the bridge for navigation, that obviously extends the ramps, and then we again enter into the issues over flood mitigation impacts on the floodplain. It's a delicate balance. A higher bridge would be more feasible at the Poulton Drive location than at the Trent Basin location. As I say, we've had initial chats with the sailing club, who predominantly their sailing takes place towards around the sailing club towards Home Pierpont, but they did say they do have a handful of times a year when they do sail up towards Trent Bridge. There are height restrictions currently on Lady Bay Bridge and Trent Bridge as well, so it's not an open expanse. So yeah, they are some of the issues that we're having to contend with in terms of the design.
Okay. Any other? Yep, Councillor Butler.
Sorry to hog.
That's all right.
Can I ask about consultation? There's reference to a consultation process will start, but what will that actually ask? Because by that point, I would imagine you will have got your suggested design ready and your location ready, I assume, or I may be wrong on that. So what will you be asking, and what realistic changes might come as a part of a consultation at that stage? And also, is it just a consultation to partners like other councils and authorities, or will it be a genuine public consultation?
In terms of, we've got obviously the steering group engagement that we spoke about previously. There's stakeholder engagement ongoing in relation to the design. At that point, we're likely to have had our preferred location and worked at that design so that we can present it in a meaningful way so that people can understand and comment. We've got a lot of work to do. As you can see, we're starting to think about explaining the connectivity. That's an important part of the bridge. So it would be a public consultation, public engagement event. We don't profess to know everything, so we would say to people, here's what we're thinking, what issues do you foresee, what benefits do you foresee, and that's an important part of our kind of development of the plan application process, as well as the optioneering. We need to understand what people think, and we may have missed something critical, and that's an important part of the process. Everybody has different views and has a different perspective, and we need to get those views in. And if there's something that isn't quite right in the scheme, we've then got a chance to amend it before we submit for planning. So I do think it's quite important, but I don't think we'd be putting 10 options together. I think we'd probably be focusing on the one and doing all we can in terms of visualization to explain how we would do that. The consultation would also then focus on the programme and then how we intend to build out the scheme. So we need to explain to people what the ramifications would be in terms of perhaps loss of access to the path for certain weeks, and to get people to understand what the implications of the buildability and the construction would be as well. So yeah, I hope that helps. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Stockwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to ask about the safety aspect, that it is actually borne in mind for pedestrians. The width of it didn't sound too wide to me, but it's hard to imagine it. There's increasing use of, well, I'll start again. Obviously, you've worked in that, you know, there will be disabled people using it, so they will have mobility issues and have sometimes e-mobility scooters and sometimes motorized ones. Will there be any limit on who can use it? I'm particularly skeptical about these e-scooters that are bumping into people, and you know, I just can't imagine what it's going to be like at sort of going in the morning time and coming back at night time. I've unfortunately gone over Lady Bay Bridge when there's been a match on, or before it starts and when it finishes, because I've not taken notice of the fact that there is a match on, and the traffic just comes to us full stop because people are across it. And if you've got e-scooters, you know, people wanting to travel a bit faster than Shanks's pony, then there are, you know, I do hope you will keep those in mind as to any sort of restrictions, really, if it's becomes necessary. Thank you.
Okay.
I probably suggest we don't get into a whole debate on e-scooters. I think we might be here all night, might be, but I think just in terms of your point, I think they're very valid in terms of the width of the bridge. 3.5 meters is actually you know, that is a very good standard. That's wider than a bus lane, for example. So it's, you know, that's what the guidance would recommend as a good width for a bridge. So I think that should give you some reassurance there that it will be a good width for this bridge. The ramps themselves, as Paul said, is going to be designed to accommodate the sort of recommendation is 1 in 20, which is a steady ramp, which means that disabled people and you know, mobility scooters and things like that would all be able to use it. If there are any sections that would be steeper than that, there'll be like resting ramps on there designed in. So it will be designed to be as disability compliant as we can make it. We'll also look at things like lighting and things like that as well to make it as secure as we can. I mean, I think as your colleague mentioned earlier, that, you know, there is going to be some issue about things like motorbikes, you know, because obviously that's something you wouldn't want to use the bridge, and you know, we'd have to look at some measures that would prevent that from occurring. In terms of things like e-scooters, obviously it depends on what the government basically does in terms of the legalisation of them. At the moment, it's other than rental scooters in trial areas, which does include Nottingham City. At the moment, they're not allowed. It wouldn't be allowed to cross the bridge, if you like, because they can only operate in the city. They can't come across. But what the government does on that in terms of legalisation, we'll just have to wait and see, really. We'll expect next year they're going to be making some decision on that. But these things have been invented, and in many ways they're not dissimilar to other you know, electric powered vehicles like e-bikes and things like that. They'll be allowed. But it's about responsible use of them, isn't it? And how you regulate those and make sure they're used safely.
Thank you very much. Right, I think we need to draw towards the recommendations. I will just ask you one more question. On one of the slides, you had what I would call a generic arrow. I'm not talking about the riverside footpaths, but I think you'd have a generic arrow pointing towards West Bridgeford Centre. Is that something that you would include in from the financing of the bridge, or was that just wishful thinking?
I mean, in terms of route itself, I think we're specifically looking at the routes that would take you towards the junction with Lady Bay Bridge and Trent Boulevard and that sort of area, because that gets you into the network of West Bridgeford. If there's, that's something we'll probably talk to Sean about in terms of where you might want to connect into from there. So that's something that I think, you know, if that was a really important part of this, if it was to take an actual route into the centre of West Bridgeford, that's something obviously we'd talk to our colleagues at the county about, and whether there'd be any funding for that.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we have the recommendations. I think recommendation A, well, we've pretty much done that anyway. Recommendation B, that's suggesting that we support the principle. And I'm just wondering whether in recommendation C, whether we give an indication in terms of proposals for a response to the consultation exercise that we welcome the proposal will support cycling and walking in the neighbouring areas and access further afield, but then perhaps as a separate comment that we have some concerns to ensure that the design does not impede river traffic, pleasure cruisers, sailing dinghies, and also that we ensure protection of trees and vegetation in the neighbourhood of the ramps and access, etc. Does that, if I was to propose that, does that meet with, does the flavour of that meet with approval? Does anybody else have any other particular comments that at this, obviously the planning application will come at some stage, so we'll be able to comment on that separately, but I believe there is going to be this consultation exercise as well, so just a question of just flagging up any particular issues. I'm quite open to suggestions, but whether those are acceptable, what I've just suggested. Councillor Butler?
Again, it might be more of a planning issue, but going back to what we were discussing about inappropriate use, so by electric bikes or scooters or whatever, the motorbike, a design should be, as far as possible, should allow or shouldn't allow, they should be designed in such a way that they are discouraged or words to that effect.
I think perhaps there's no reason why another comment along those in general terms. Obviously, again, when the planning application comes, we can be more specific, but in general terms, just to flag up the issue, that also we hope that access issues by undesirable vehicles can be addressed in some shape or form. I realise it's a very difficult balancing act, because how do you allow a wheelchair and a mobility scooter and not allow a motorised moped or a motorbike? But I'm not the magician here. I think you're the magician, so
no pressure there.
It's up to you to try and fight. But in general terms, members, are we happy with those three?
Yes.
Sort of issues? And I think Councillor Butler's seconding that. So are those? Do they seem for the officers? Do they seem reasonable concerns and issues to be included? Yep. So all those in favour of what I've just proposed? I think that looks unanimous as far as I can see. That's brilliant. Great. Lovely. So thank you very much indeed to both of you for coming along and giving us that information, which has been very useful, and thanks for that courtesy. And obviously we'll wait for the consultation exercise and the planning application in due course. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Let's now move on to agenda item 5, which relates to the provision of cycling networks in the borough. We have got 3 presentations on this one, so I'll just make another plea to our presenters, if it could be kept really succinct and focused. And I think it might be better if we have the 3 presentations and then sort of ask questions and comments, because otherwise it's possible that the 3rd presentation might well answer questions to the first one, for example. So I think that's probably the best way to proceed, otherwise we might be duplicating things. So without further ado, I think Sean Parks, we got the Sean Parks's presentation at first, so from the County Council. Perhaps could you just, in introducing it, if you could just explain to the members of the group what your role is on the County Council. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. As it says, I'm Sean Parks. I manage the local transport plan and programme development team. So our responsibility is both the development of transport strategy, all forms of transport, but also then developing the programmes to deliver that strategy. That's it in a nutshell, really. Thanks, Catherine. Derek asked me to come along today, recognising obviously Rushcliffe wanted to have a say in future cycling strategy, but recognising also their limited role in some of it when they don't control the highways effectively, how they can input into cycling strategy, but also the programmes that we deliver in order to deliver that strategy. So these are the key things I'm going to just very quickly go over, but also highlight some of the things which I think Rushcliffe could input into. So thanks, Catherine. First one is national, regional strategy and local strategy. I'm sure that Claire is going to cover the justification for such schemes, so I didn't intend going over all of that. The local strategy, that's really just a list just to show you the level of input that cycling has in all of the strategy we deliver. Thanks, Catherine. The one that I did want to talk about, though, is the council plan. The council plan really is the document or the strategy which effectively identifies all of the works, whether it's strategy, programmes, activities that the council delivers. It's the priorities within that. Our current administration, our new administration is currently reviewing that and refreshing that, which may have an impact on future transport strategy, because obviously we need to make sure that our existing strategy still tallies with what is their priorities going forward over the next 4 years. Obviously, we might not need to change them. The one thing that we will need to change is the implementation plan, because that's tied in with our funding periods, so government spending reviews. They were meant to have it last year, it was delayed. So it should be this financial year, in which case obviously we will update the implementation plan. That has a knock-on effect in terms of the cycling strategy delivery plan. That's effectively our 10-point plan on how working with partners such as yourselves, how we aim to actually get more people cycling more often. It's unlikely that that will need to change because it is quite a broad strategy, but the action plan, again, will probably need refreshing in line with the implementation plan. Thank you. So potential Rushcliffe roles in this, obviously stakeholder consultee in all of our strategy, you always are. But there's also, obviously, you do have an estate yourselves, and it's how you review that to make sure that cycling development plans for your estate, and not necessarily new routes, but obviously there is electric bike charging points, for example, within car parks, because cycling is not only just about two-wheelers, three-wheelers, electric bikes and the like. We're already working very closely on some of these measures, such as air quality action plans, which we've developed together, and obviously local plan developer contribution strategy. A few things regarding funding for cycling. Obviously, the high scheme costs mean that external funding is required for all cycling schemes now. There was a time when we could deliver them with integrated transport block, but obviously improved highway design, cycling design guides mean that more segregated schemes are required, specifically now, obviously, in order to secure the funding. That means they're an awful lot more expensive than they used to be. I don't know whether, sorry, you're going to cover that kind of thing, but that's a whole thing in itself. Funding opportunities as well. We're still, government are intending to give us more certainty over long-term funding, but we're still not getting that at the moment. There is obviously the Actual Travel Fund, which is great to have quite a significant amount of funding available for these schemes, but there's a constant bidding round currently. We've had to do 3 bidding rounds in the last year to try and secure funding, which obviously is quite a draining resource. It also means, because the delivery side of that and the short timescales for delivery, usually within the next financial year, means that you're quite limited to what you can deliver with that funding. It's obviously things that were within the existing highway network, rather than, for example, when you get longer term funding, such as Transforming Cities Fund, then you can actually procure land, acquire land where it's required, for example, and build much bigger schemes. Obviously, continue with the developer contributions and collaboration on bids. We've already mentioned on the Transforming Cities Fund, we're working with the city, but we also do work with the districts. Oh, sorry, I send that over to the next slide. Sorry. Working with the districts, we've maximised funding opportunities. So, for example, on town deal bids in other districts, the Transforming Cities Fund, as we mentioned earlier, consideration of cycling infrastructure in those bids. So it's not normally cycling infrastructure, but trying to engage that funding with those, so that we can actually deliver improvements as part of those wider schemes, and obviously continuing to secure releasing the funds from developers. In terms of actual strategic assessment for cycle improvements, it's a 5-step thing realistically. The first one is the local cycling walking infrastructure plan, which Chris mentioned earlier, which is D2N2Y. This is a route assessment tool, effectively. It's the way that we prioritize and assess all of our schemes in a consistent way. You can imagine we receive hundreds and hundreds of requests. I know that Hugh, for example, has hundreds and hundreds of requests, and that's not and so to make sure that we compare those with every other scheme across the whole of the county, we need to have a consistent tool, and this is what this route assessment tool does. It basically is based on evidence of need and propensity to cycle. By propensity to cycle, we're talking about, if we build some infrastructure, what's the likely increase in cycling going to result from that? And we do that over a number of strategic objectives, which are those ones listed there. The intention of this is effectively to have a short, medium and long-term infrastructure priority schemes across the whole of the D2N2 area. As Chris mentioned earlier, we've done it that way, particularly for consistency across the whole area, but it's also making sure that we're joined up in terms of going across those boundaries, because cyclists don't see those administrative boundaries, obviously. Thank you. This is just a very, very quick thing. Just some of the things, obviously, we want to mention. Our priorities for cycling were reviewed only last September by Community and Place Committee, which was chaired by Councillor Cotty here. So they are quite up to date. They also at the same meeting approved our provisional short-term highways infrastructure priorities. Now, these were effectively the Transforming Cities Fund schemes, to link into those, which are subject to a number of caveats, I should say, which I won't go into. Also, routes that tie into our visitor economy strategy particularly, and that's more important going forward, obviously, with COVID-19 recovery. Now, again, the bridge we've just been talking about links into that, because obviously the link from the sporting arena to Home Pierpont is one of those routes. So there is that. Now, in terms of transfer, it also approved our Active Travel Fund Tranche 2 schemes, which was a scheme which goes along Regatta Way, which again links to Home Pierpont, but also potentially to the new bridge and linking to that. And we're trying to obviously work with colleagues to make that joined up thing. And I think that the LC WIP, Local Cycle Walking Infrastructure, has obviously helped with that work process. One of the other things which is worth noting is obviously approval of the LTN 120, which is cycle design standards, into our existing highway design principles. That's a requirement now realistically in order to secure future DFT funding, and further assessment of our prioritisation of our local routes. We've been undertaking that in addition to the LC WIP to make them a little bit more robust and transparent to everybody. And our members asked us to do that. It's not belittling the LC WIP, it's just basically an addition to that. And that's just for the routes within our county. So the intention, as Chris says, we've now completed that work, and we're about to, well, we're just in the process of designing the consultation for it. Thanks. Step 2, 3, 4, 5 are the next steps. The route assessment tool doesn't identify schemes, it identifies corridors where you're going to get that. The next stage is obviously the feasibility, design and deliverability. Now, because of the limited resources we have for that design work, generally they're the short-term priorities that we're currently looking at and designing. And the other thing, obviously, as mentioned, the highway constraints. Because of the short term of the funding, often we're limited to what we can deliver within that timescale. So we are limited to what we can deliver within our existing highway constraints. Now, there is obviously various options in terms of acquiring land. That takes a long time, which means they're pushed down the line. Similarly, you could reallocate road space, but that potentially has impacts on your next step, which is your value for money assessment. Because if you're reallocating road space away from other vehicles, which means that you're creating congestion, worse air quality, you soon negate some of the benefits, which means that there is no justification for your scheme anymore. So you have to be mindful of that and trying to balance these priorities. The other thing is the criteria for favourable funding. I put that in really just to show how it highlights, how it influences, and that's what the next few slides are really very, very quick to do that. And the other thing, the local support for proposals, a new deal, and well, it's not something we've always done anyway, is actually consult to make sure that not necessarily consensus, everyone doesn't have to agree with it, but there has to be broad public buy-in on these schemes, because otherwise people aren't going to accept them. If we just flick onto the next one. It's very difficult to see this. This is actually Tolleton Lane. Using the route assessment tool, you can see on this, if you look at all of the priorities, so all of the strategic priorities are looking at congestion, health, leisure, growth, it comes out as a medium priority. So that'd be yellow line. If you go and click onto the next one, if you were looking at just health, the health index multiple deprivation isn't that high in this area. So consequently, it'd be a low priority. And then on the next one, and I think these are ones which I think the district yourself might be more keen on it. This shows you how high priority is when you look at just a development. So I think this tool will help, I think, going forward, identifying those schemes where you might want to try and secure developer contributions in order to deliver such schemes. Thank you. So again, this is basically what we've done so far and your role within this. LC WIP, if I'm not mistaken, Catherine, you might have even been to the first one of our stakeholder events, probably a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, before, I think it was before you went on maternity leave, so it's that long ago. But yeah, Rushcliffe have attended these and will obviously continue to be part of that. Scheme route suggestions, we're always open to ideas. They will, however, be assessed alongside everything else. And prioritize along that. Data refresh, we use it, the assessment tool is all evidence-based. So effectively, if you've got more up-to-date information on planned growth other than your local plan, we'd be happy to accept it and update that information to give it a more accurate assessment. And again, obviously going forward, I was talking about its integration into infrastructure priorities. The only other thing I really wanted to skirt over, that's the wrong thing to say, is it's not just about infrastructure, it's about coordinating these with behaviour change programmes, which we call the Travel Choice Programme. Just to give an example, when we delivered the West Bridgeford cycle route improvements in 2016-17, we followed that with in 2018 with residential travel planning, which resulted in a 6% decrease in car shared on journeys to work, 2% increase in cycle trips to work amongst participants, and 4% increase in cycle trips to shops amongst participants. I think you need to do that work in order to maximise the benefits from the infrastructure, making people aware of what's out there and encouraging them to use it. Now, there is funding available for measures in 21-22 alongside or to support our Active Travel Fund Tranche 2 programmes. They have been delayed simply because of COVID-19 and the way that we deliver those. There is potential that some of those could be in Rushcliffe, obviously, with the Regatta Way scheme. So that's just the next steps effectively. Active Travel Fund Tranche 3 bid. The closing date for that is the 9th of August. So we're currently working on that. Similarly, potential mini Holland schemes, which would be much looking at a focused area and how we can improve all of the routes into that area. Again, they have to be evidence-based and they have to be on locations where there's the greatest propensity to increase cycling. We're currently doing that work, and obviously our members will make the decisions of what is included in those bids. The consultation that both Chris and I have referred to regarding the D2N2 infrastructure plans, that should happen sometimes before, over summer, late summer, realistically. Obviously, after that, our committee will determine what our Notts Highway and cycling infrastructure priorities will be going forward in the short, medium and long term. And then the implementation of the plan update following the spending review, followed by the action plan review for cycling. I think that should be it.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Time's getting on, so let's go straight on to, I think Hugh McClintock's presentation is next, is it? Yeah. So we're straight on to you and
Right. Okay,
again,
Chairman.
keep it
I
brief.
know I've got a lot of slides to get through, so I'm going to go through fairly quickly. A lot of them will speak for themselves. Only a few will I say much. Most will be fairly brief captions. Next slide, please. First, just background, the tremendous increase in cycling we've seen in the last year or so. A lot of that was, of course, in the first few months of the lockdown. People free to get out without being worried, intimidated by the traffic, enjoying it, and cycling levels greatly increased. Yes, okay, they went down later last year, but I believe government figures show nevertheless that cycling levels are still about nationally 46% above what they were pre-COVID lockdown. A lot of people in the right conditions are very keen to cycle and of course to walk more. Next slide, please. Key document now, published a year ago by the government, is this document, Gear Change, a bold vision for cycling and walking. A lot about making walking and cycling the default modes for short trips in urban areas. A bold vision, and that was launched by the Prime Minister, in fact, in a Peace and Runs over a year ago. Next slide, please. Along with that came the new guidance on cycle infrastructure design, Local Transport Note 20. Sean's mentioned it already, and I'm going to refer to it quite a bit in the rest of this talk. Basic message of that is that government expects councils to up their game in terms of the quality of cycle infrastructure design. Okay, the more expensive and needs more space, and providing for a different range of bicycles, not just a standard two-wheel bike. Right, next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, key principle. Do bear in mind these, and I'll show some examples that illustrate these, both good and less good later on. Networks and routes that are coherent, that join up. Direct, not routes that take you a long way and take you much further than when you're driving. Safe, obviously, safe in terms of safety from traffic, but also safety from the risk of personal assault. Comfortable in terms of widths and services, and attractive, the route being attractive and the surroundings. Next slide, please. That new guidance also contains, this is very relevant for Rushcliffe, special advice on cycling in relation to new developments. And given the scale of new housing development in the borough, this is very important. All the opportunities you've got with especially major developments like Fareham Pastures and Gampston Urban Fields in the next few years to get good quality walking and cycling infrastructure with good links to other routes in the area. Next slide, please. Just examples of those. Of course, there are lots of other rather small scale ones taking place all around. I know much of Rushcliffe for the next few years. Next slide, please. Right, you need to know where the routes are. Unfortunately, there's no up-to-date mapping for Rushcliffe. The best mapping actually is in the Nottingham City map, just half buried on the top right of the picture there. And the Nottingham Cycle Map, last revised 2 years ago, does cover quite a lot of Rushcliffe and indeed Broxtowe and Gedling. The County Council did a series of maps about 10, 15 years ago, including one for South Nottinghamshire that covered Rushcliffe and bits of Broxtowe as well. And there was also, the Rushcliffe Borough Council produced a map 2003, fairly broad brush for the whole of Rushcliffe, but with a very useful inset for West Bridgeford. It'd be good to see that updated. Next slide, please. Yeah, these are the maps to refer to if you're looking at routes. Okay, particularly as I say, Nottingham City map covers a lot of Rushcliffe. That's quite up to date. Next slide, please. Right, the heart of the talk then is assessing the quality of routes. With particular reference to these core design principles. Now, I know that a lot of these schemes, facilities in Rushcliffe have been in, like those elsewhere around Nottingham for, in some cases, 25, 30 or 35 years. And, you know, national guidance and local guidance was much weaker then. So you may say, well, it's unfair to judge that in relation to current new guidance that's been published in the last year. But I think still these core principles do shed some useful light on, you know, where the better ones are and the not so good ones are. Next one, please. Now, obviously, it's very important to have close coordination in infrastructure provision. The County Council is the highway authority. Rushcliffe, obviously, is local planning authority, especially in respect of good cycle infrastructure in new housing developments. Highways England, trunk roads, the A52 particularly, and A46 and A453. And of course, in the case of new developments, making the most of developer contributions to all mesh together. So most talk is focusing on the role of Rushcliffe as a planning authority, but always emphasising the need for close coordination with these other organisations. Excellent, please. Again, relating particularly these core principles. And yes, okay, standards have moved on, but the government is expecting higher standards of provision now. Next slide, please. The first one, coherence of networks and routes. Essentially, things should join up. They should be connected. They should be networks, not individual routes, but networks planned and designed to allow people to reach their day-to-day destinations easily along routes that connect, are simple to navigate, easy to follow, don't take you out of the way where you don't expect, and of a consistently high quality. And cycle direction signing is an important part of that, but also the design of the routes. Next slide, please. Routes should always join up, and unfortunately that's not always the case. I know there are ambitious plans. I mean, if you look at the whole Melton Road and Walton area, there are plans there for active travel routes, and okay, the development is only half built so far, but it's very important to make sure all these links do eventually join up coherently, easy to follow. Next slide, please. Also, LTN 120 says, when talking about coherence, neither cyclists nor pedestrians benefit from unintuitive arrangements to put cyclists in unexpected places away from the carriageway. Example of that, the very awkward crossing of Wilford Lane on the tramside path there, where you have to sort of zigzag to get round, and it doesn't feel safe, it's very awkward. Next slide, please. A good example of where routes don't join up is with the new developments on Milton Road in the Walton area. You've got bits of shared path put in some 2 or 3 years ago that just come to a stop. Why is it taking so long to have all of these coherent link all the way from the Linksbar roundabout through to Village Street at Walton, and where the existing cycle lanes are that end that were put in by the County Council about 5 years ago? That cries out for not just fragmented links, which are very little value of cyclists, but things that do join up. Next slide, please. Regatta Way, Sean's mentioned this already, and I'm very glad to hear about the active travel funding for Regatta Way that the County Council have got. But again, to make the most of that, it does need linking to Gamston, again, Gamston Fields housing site, and a vital link to and from the new foot cycle bridge we were hearing about earlier. Next slide, please. Cycle routes should be at least as direct, preferably more direct than those private motor vehicles. Cyclists are much less likely to use a route if it takes them a long way out of their way, especially if they have to stop a lot. And that's a key difference in the new guidance. Next slide, please. The tramside path, basically the one between the Riverside by Wilford and through to Running Lane tram stop, is straight and mostly a good width. And that is, you know, a direct route. So that's definitely one of the better ones in the area. Next slide, please. Continuity of priority, that's being emphasised. There are actually some recent schemes in Nottingham, because Nottingham did revise its own cycle infrastructure guidance about 4 or 5 years ago. We can learn from some of those, but clearly demarcated areas for pedestrians and cyclists, direct good services, etc. Next slide, please. And even some of the older schemes in Rushcliffe, this is an example from Compton Acres. I mean, the housing put in, what, about 30, 35 years ago, does include some shortcuts in cul-de-sac that are not just footpaths, they're separate footpaths and cycleways. That was actually quite enlightened from a vision at that time and helps to provide more direct routes for those housing areas. Next slide, please. Again, a change in the new guidances. Cyclists shouldn't be expected to give way every minor road, every side road. Cyclists should have more priority and preferably reinforced by signs and markings and raising the surface as well. If you get a whole series of these, some cyclists, faster cyclists, will just ignore them and ride on the road, which may actually be less safe. So that's an important principle, key change. Next slide, please. Some of the schemes put in a few years ago with the new housing on Melton Road at Walton, again, they're not direct. They take you a long way out of their way, and you know, less confident cyclists may not mind using those, but more confident ones are likely to stick to the road just because it's more direct and you don't have to wait so long. Next slide, please. Another key thing for walkers as well as cyclists is trying to have new housing developments that are permeable, direct links, more direct than those for motor vehicles. But when you've got direct links, don't go and block them off, like this example from the Wilford Fields housing site, which of course was completed last year. Next slide, please. Safety, second key principle. Cycle infrastructure must be safe. It should also be perceived to be safe so that more people feel able to cycle. Next slide, please. And this example, a very current one in view of the site visit we had with several of us here present with Ruth Evans MP just a few weeks ago, working with the Ramblers, I might say, closely in other groups to get this subway under the A52 south of Sharp Hill, upgraded as part of a longer route linking say Walton and West Bridgeford through to Runnington, key link, and anything like that when it's well designed, well lit, and good approaches will give great safety advantages. Next slide, please. Toucan Crossing, that was put in back to Highways England between east of Gaveston about 20 years ago after a lot of lobbying by pedals. That's a much safer link for cyclists and walkers across that very busy road. Next slide, please. Safety of cyclists and pedestrians. Another important change about LT 120, current advice is on main routes in particular, you should have segregation of cyclists and pedestrians, not mix the two together. And again, some of that has been pioneered recently in some of the newer schemes in Nottingham. Next slide, please. Space for cycling is important, but not narrow advisory lanes or ones hemmed in by guardrails. No particular examples here locally, but it's an important principle nationally. Next slide, please. Comfort, again, another core principle. Comfortable conditions, good quality, well-maintained services, adequate width for the volume of users, minimal stopping and starting and avoiding steep gradients. Next slide, please. Avoid uncomfortable transitions between on and off carriageway sections, particularly locations where conflict with other road users is more likely. Next slide, please. A good example of that is the end of Davis Road, Radcliffe Road, where if you're trying to get onto that cycle path, it's an awkward place, especially as a cyclist. You don't see easily the indicators of traffic, motor vehicles turning into Davis Road because they're obscured by the safety barriers at the edge of the road. Next slide, please. Not again, paths are not constrained. Basically a good path along by the tram, but what a pity that bit through to Runnington Lane, the last bit, is only about a standard footway width and not decent 3 meters, which is much more comfortable for walkers and cyclists. Next slide, please. That's an example from Radcliffe, Highways England scheme. It's been like that for years, you know. Can you imagine cyclists and pedestrians being squeezed in such a narrow area? Next slide, please. Avoid sharp bends. And although I mentioned earlier some good features about Compton Acres 30 years ago, there are some awkward bits when you've got these narrow bends, or Civil Road, Radcliffe Road on the right. Next one, please. Barriers also. I know there are some often strong pressure for barriers in some areas, but in general, LTM 120 discourages use of barriers on off-road paths, except in exceptional circumstances. Got to be very compelling reasons. Next slide, please. And obviously comfort in terms of surface and width, and many examples of that. The Riverside path we mentioned already, that's going to be a crucial link to the new bridge. Improving the surface there is vital, and that, indeed, like the other example, Home Lane, are part of Route 15 of the South Strand National Cycle Route Network. Next one, right, attractiveness, the last core one. Cycle infrastructure should help to deliver public spaces that are well designed and finished in attractive materials, be places that people want to spend time using. They should be positive contributions to the public realm. Next slide, please. That's one brief example. Next slide, please. Cockgrave Greenway, very pleasant in terms of its surroundings, opened 3 or 4 years ago, mainly a leisure route, but that's been a big asset to the recreational network in Rushcliffe. Next slide, please. And don't forget also, as part of an attractive route, cycle parking at key destinations, well located and well accessible. If it's outside health centres or shopping centres. Next slide, please. Outside shopping centres, try and have cycle parking out as near as possible to the store entrance, not tucked away around the back or around the side, like at Aldi in Walton. Next slide, please. Right, we're moving towards the end. Just a few other things on attractiveness. Be careful with signs and markings. Sometimes they can make unattractive additions to the streetscape. Next slide, please. Attractiveness to surroundings is vital. It's already all having a safer link. We're trying to get Highways England provide under the 852 at Sharp Hill, but that is very intimidating to people to use now, not just in muddy weather. So as part of that, it's very important that the subway itself is made much more inviting, as well as the approach routes. Next slide, please. Right, just a few other things to finish with. Other principles of importance, it's not just LTN1 advice. Next slide, please. Links within Rushcliffe. Obviously, I've talked a lot about West Bridgeford, but links to the other settlements further out. And bearing in mind the growing popularity of e-bikes is going to make it much more feasible in future to have people commuting by bike from settlements further out, like Bingham or Eastleigh, etc. Links to Nottingham, especially improved river crossings, but also to and from Clifton and other areas, Wilford. Promoting cycling for leisure and tourism. Lots of great potential for that in Rushcliffe, needs to be accompanied by updated mapping. working closely with other organisations, the police obviously in various ways, and pedals, Rywise and Sustrans we're hearing from soon, and working closely with schools, employers, health professionals, promoting the very strong health environmental aspects of cycling more broadly. Next slide, please. In terms of leisure links, some of the key things you've got in Rushcliffe that have great potential, they can be enhanced further. And again, the bridge will help as a recreational key link into the borough for that. Rushcliffe Country Park, often I know suffers from chronic car parking pressures. Why not do much more to make it easier to get there on a bike? Along the Trent, Home Pierpont, the Watt Sports Centre and Country Park, Skylarks Nature Reserve, the Grantham Canal Towpath, Cockgrave Country Park and Greenway, the whole Vale of Beaver area, all these great things for recreational cycling. Next slide, please. You may not be aware that actually some years ago, 2003, Rushcliffe Borough Council produced the cycle routes booklet in Rushcliffe. Again, it would be very good to see that updated now, especially with all the new connectivity that's going to come with the new bridge once that's complete. Next slide, please. And don't forget new funding sources. Sean referred to this already. I know funding is often a problem, but there is money available from DFT if you're prepared to make bids. Transforming Cities Active Travel in this new Millie Holland scheme. It's based on some of the best practice in parts of London, like Walthamstow and so on. Much more bike and walking friendly areas with reduced traffic pressure, It also makes a great contribution to the public realm. Okay, just finishing the top 3 issues, Pedal, to emphasise again, higher design standards, making use of new guidance, updating planning policy to make sure that's reflected, this guidance is reflected, requiring developers and new housing sites to follow the guidance, make provision that reflects it, maximising coherence, connectivity with existing and planned routes. I've talked a lot about the new development areas, but also the need to join it to existing routes in the existing urban areas in West Bridgford and more widely in the borough. Right, and thank you. Sorry I had to rush through, but I hope that's covered some of the ground.
Thank you for that number 10 briefing, Professor Chris Whitty. Next slide, please. Right. And on to Claire Motley from Sustrans, please.
Hi there, and thanks to you. That was a great run through of policy and LTN 120, so it was a really helpful introduction. I'm Claire Motley. I'm the England Director for the Midlands and East at Sustrans. Next slide, please. Sustrans, for those of you that don't know us, we're the UK-wide charity, and we make it easier for people to walk and cycle. We're also the custodians of the National Cycle Network, or the NCN, as I'm probably going to refer to it in a moment. But we actually own less than 5% of the land that the NCN's on, but we work with others, we work in partnership, and we look after the network, we promote the vision for the network, and we develop those routes. And we work much more broadly than that, and I'm going to cover that as well. But across our remit, we raise ambition, we demonstrate change on the ground, and we amplify voices for change by engaging stakeholders and citizens. As a charity, we've got 600 employees, just over now actually. We've got 3,000 volunteers, and we've got 30,000 supporters. Next slide, please. Thanks. Our charity's vision is a society where the way we travel creates healthier places and happier lives for everyone. And our mission is simple, just to make it easier for people to walk and cycle. As part of our work, we've got 2 strategic priorities covering us from now to 2025. And these are paths for everyone and livable cities and towns for everyone. So just starting with paths for everyone, that's about having a UK-wide network of traffic-free paths for everyone, connecting cities, towns and countryside, and loved by the communities that they serve. And just to give you an idea what we mean by that, we aim for infrastructure that could be used by typical 12-year-old unaccompanied and people really new to cycling. We also want, when we say for everyone, we mean the whole range of users, so walkers, people in wheelchairs, cyclists, people in adapted bikes, trikes, e-cargo bikes, whatever it might be, and pushchairs. We're really trying to think about a wide range of users. Our second priority is the livable cities and towns for everyone. And that's about places that connect us to each other and what we need and where everyone can thrive without having to need a car. And central to our vision of both these priorities is for everyone. And we do this by working to make sure that the benefits of walking and cycling and healthy places are experienced by everyone, because they're not experienced equitably at the moment, and that's something we feel needs to change. Next slide, please. So Paths for Everyone. We launched our Paths for Everyone report and vision in 2018, And this set out our vision and aspiration to improve the 12,000 miles of the National Cycle Network across the UK. We also did an audit of quality of the network at that time, the existing NCN, and we're working actively with local authorities and others right now across the country to improve the quality of the NCN, beginning with those sections that are identified as being poor quality, where we really need to improve things. Over the last 3 years, the Department for Transport has invested £22 million across 3 tranches of funding that come via Sustrans to improve on-road and traffic-free stretches of the National Cycle Network. And following the DfT's publication of gear change last year, which you just mentioned, we're anticipating that funding for the NCN will increase in coming years. So we're hopeful there'll be an announcement about that quite soon. And just over the past year, one of the schemes that we've been delivering is on the NCN 6 in Nottingham City Centre, so Nottingham City Links. So we're working closely with Chris and others on that. Next slide, please. In terms of our livable cities and towns for everyone priority, oh, you might need to sort of go through to, thank you. It's one more. Thank you. So I wanted to share what we mean when we say livable city, because it might not be self-explanatory. For us, livable cities and towns means designing and realising urban spaces that have social connection, that deliver 20-minute neighbourhoods. And by that, we mean where you can get from where you live to where you need to get to for facilities and amenities within a 10-minute walk there and a 10-minute walk back. So really accessible. We want places that focus on health and clean air and green space, and that celebrate roots and character, where everyone can move around healthily. And we see these things as really important, so not just aspirational actually, but vital, because the way that we travel has a tremendous impact on places and people. And in fact, Grant Shapps said something very similar today when he launched the DfT's decarbonisation plan for transport. He said something very similar to that. And it's true that some of the biggest challenges facing leaders right now in this country are connected to the way we travel. So, for example, climate change, air quality, health problems worsened by inactivity, isolation and loneliness, inequality and deprivation. And that's what this priority within Sustrans is seeking to address. Next slide, please. So transforming the towns and cities in the way I've just described will have many benefits. And I'm just going to run through these very briefly because I'm sure that everyone will be quite familiar with them. And beginning with the climate crisis. So transport is now the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the UK. And the UK's carbon targets cannot be met without reducing the amount of car travel. And as I say, it was good to see the government publish its transport decarbonisation plan just this morning. So to achieve our targets, we're going to require policies which actively seek to reduce car travel. And I think Nottingham's workplace parking levy is a nationally recognised example of an effective policy in that realm. Next slide, please. Designing places that put public health and wellbeing first is vital. So that includes things like air quality, road safety, an opportunity to achieve good physical and mental health. So we know that 8 out of 10 people do not do the recommended level of physical activity, and that poorer people are even less likely to do so. Air pollution is killing tens of thousands of people prematurely across the UK every year. So 4.5 million children in the UK are growing up in areas with illegal levels of air pollution. And road transport is responsible for 80% of nitrous oxide pollution, where legal limits are being broken. And we know that it's not just burning fuel from cars that's the problem. Almost half of the particulate matter actually comes from the tyre and brake wear. So even if we were to switch all our cars from petrol and diesel to electric, we've still got a particulate problem associated with car travel. Next slide, please. So finally, social isolation and loneliness. I just want to bring out the fact that the most vulnerable people suffer the most acute disadvantages from poorly designed urban areas and transport systems dominated by cars. And loneliness and isolation are major public health and wellbeing issues. Where neighbourhoods are severed by major roads and blighted by high levels of traffic, with the danger and noise that brings, it deters the kind of social interaction that's actually the glue that binds communities together and that connects people to each other. So the way we travel is critical to all of these urgent problems that we face in our towns, and our towns should feel inclusive and safe for everyone. And for that, we really feel like we need to stop designing for cars and start designing for people. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to run through some of the ways that we are working with partners on solutions to these problems by making it easier for people to walk and cycle, and some of our recommendations to the local authorities that we work with. So we recommend that local authorities firstly pursue really high quality segregated cycle infrastructure whether that's National Cycle Network or other routes. And Hugh's just given a great example of what we mean by good quality cycle infrastructure. So we're currently delivering training to local authority highway teams across the country, and we're hoping that will soon be rolled out to elected members as well, about local transport note 120 that Hugh's has been talking about. And we're doing that on behalf of the Department for Transport, because that's an important part of raising ambition and understanding about what the art of the possible and what can be achieved. Along with that, our engineers are currently working in Nottingham City Council on some of those schemes that Chris mentioned, using the Active Travel Fund and Transforming Cities Fund. So that's bringing our specialism and expertise to local authorities where that's relevant. And secondly, we recommend that local authorities explore new and bold ideas for improving livability in urban areas. So there's lots of new initiatives that can be introduced, and some of those have already been mentioned. So 20-minute neighbourhoods is a good one to look at. Mini Hollands, we've got this expression of interest call from the Department of Transport for 12 of those across the country, and funding associated with that. Low traffic neighbourhoods, road space reallocation, 20-mile-per-hour speed limit zones, school streets where you can close the roads immediately outside traffic to motor vehicles and open it to people travelling actively at the times of the school run to make it that much easier and the best choice for people to travel actively to school in the morning. And quiet ways, which is a way of looking at reducing traffic for more rural networks. And we can work with councils to understand and design and deliver these kinds of interventions. We'd really encourage people to look at that. And thirdly, we recommend councils engage their residents in a collaborative design approach. So that's about having workshops and on-street trials of proposed changes. And our co-design projects at Sustrans help residents to really understand the challenges and the competing needs. And by being part of that really interactive process, you tend to find there's much more support and mandate for the changes once they're brought in, because people understand the compromise that's necessary and the kind of vision and aspiration of what can be delivered. Fourthly, we just want to recognise how important these local authority LC WIPs, so the local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, are. These are a really increasingly important way of prioritising investment in active travel and in persuading the Department for Transport that there's a clear local plan and that it's worth investment in these schemes. And we've been supporting local authorities with the development of their LC WIPs and in designs of visualisations to take them to the next stage of delivery. And we recommend that councils put in place behaviour change programmes to help overcome the barriers that people experience even when there's good infrastructure. And that's about making that switch to active travel. So that could be personal travel planning advice, and route advice. It could be cycle skills or confidence building about cycling in traffic. It could be basic bike mechanics and kind of understanding how to keep bikes on the road and in a good state of repair. And we deliver lots of those kind of programmes right across the country and in Nottingham, in schools, in workplaces. And in fact, in Nottingham City Council, we do a really effective programme that's with job seekers specifically, looking for routes to employment and education. And once infrastructure is in place, we recommend that councils promote and activate that new infrastructure to make sure it's really well used and you're getting the best value for money. So they're just some of the ideas that we have for achieving change. And I've got one final slide. Thank you. So I wanted to finish by saying that we know there's support for this kind of change. So from surveys carried out across the UK and our bike life research, we found there's actually huge support for change and for reducing the dominance of cars in our streets. And that's not surveys amongst people already cycling, that's a general population survey that we carry out. But saying that, I recognise that change isn't always easy, and I know that dissent can sometimes be very loud, and it can sometimes be a little bit ugly. But time and again, research shows us that there is a quiet majority of people who recognise the need for change, who recognise the need to tackle these big problems like climate change, and who are open-minded to trying some of the kinds of interventions I've just been talking about. I think that even where change is uncomfortable, debate is good because it means people are thinking about what else is possible, they're thinking about the issues and that change is happening. I think it's a really good place for active travel at the moment. I just want to round off by saying the government's got some, it's published gear change, it's published its transport decarbonisation plan, it's published the detailed guidance on that Hugh ran through on local transport note 120. And there's record funding available from this government to implement change for the Active Travel Fund and Capability Fund, Transforming Cities Fund, Safer Streets Fund and other parts. So it's absolutely the right time to be ambitious and look for bold change rather than incremental change. There's a statement in the Birmingham Transport Plan released last year that I thought really captured this aspiration well. In their plan, the City Council states, active travel will become how most people get around their locality most of the time. Cars will no longer dominate street life around homes and schools. Residential neighbourhoods and local centres will be places where people are put first. Thanks. That's all from me.
Right, thank you very much indeed. We haven't got much time left. We may have to, I think, sort of bring this, or partly bring it back again, perhaps. I apologise. I meant to bring Derek Hayden in first, just briefly. I don't know whether Mr. Hayden, are there any comments you want to make at all in any context? No. Okay. Open to questions or comments. Any contributions? Councillor Phillips.
Thank you, Chairman. These are mainly sort of directed at questions at Sean. So I'm a keen cyclist and I have certain preferences of cycle tracks that I want to be on. An example would be the one outside of the tram track, lovely and smooth, perfect, obviously not long enough. I like long rides, so I use the roads. And one example is Melton Road through West Bridgeford. I love it. You got that 1.5 meters with the line where cyclists know they've got that space to work in. And when you're coming up to sort of drain covers and, you know, badly fitting drain covers and potholes around them, you can move out, and the motorist also sees that you're still within your white line. So I'd like to see more of that where we can physically get it in for, you know, people like me, the older generation who like to cycle on roads, shall we say, because I think that is a lot safer and it's a cheap alternative to get lots and lots of extra cycling lanes within the borough. Where there aren't those lines and you're using the road, the cyclist is using probably 1 to 2 feet of the road from the curb, and again you're hitting all those drain covers where they're badly fitted. There's holes all around them, you're bouncing in them, and you know, if you've got 14-inch tyres on 100 psi, you really do feel that through your backside. So if we could sort of spend some money on improving those, cyclists can stay in a nice straight line. They haven't got to weave around drain covers, and we're a lot safer, and also car drivers aren't suddenly seeing somebody swerving out and they're having to move across the road. The other thing that I think again is a nice, cheap, easy fix is a lot of these boxes at traffic lights where cyclists come to the front of the queue. A lot of the paintwork is very worn out. You can't see the painted signs. A lot of motorists don't understand what that box is because they pull up right into it. And also, I'd like to see something like 10 meters before the traffic lights, where you sometimes get this little painted line at the side, so cyclists can go up the inside to get to that box. So you're sitting at the front of the queue of traffic, not sitting behind it, taking in all those nasty gases out of the exhaust. So, you know, I think there are some easy fixes. Also, if there's any plans for cycle routes within a particular ward, I think it's important that the ward councillors are consulted because they will know their area. And I'll give you an example of that. I'm Compton Acres ward councillor, and on Rugby Road by the recycle centre, they went ahead and narrowed the road and put cycling and a shared pathway, made it wider. It's not used, and the road being so narrow causes so many problems. So, you know, if we'd have been consulted about that, we could have maybe offered alternatives for cyclists, and there was alternatives, but we couldn't then put the road back. So I think it's important that we do sort of liaise with those ward councillors before any sort of decisions are made. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Do you have any responses to all that long list of requests?
Yeah. No, I think a lot of that, to be honest, is covered by the new highway, the new design standards. In all honesty, I think the interesting thing is that what you were talking about in terms of the lanes on Melton Road, which were delivered probably about 5 years ago, is they actually wouldn't meet any current design standards now. They do have to be segregated in order to secure that funding. In saying that, obviously, there's horses for courses, for a better way for putting it. But the reality is we would want to put segregated lanes on wherever we could, simply because that's going to encourage you would want to use it, but also the less confident cyclists are going to want to use it. And it's about getting that shift of people onto cycles for that long-term change. Then in terms of the maintenance, you would have noticed possibly that when I actually put up the funding, maintenance was one of the things that I put up there. I think that's key in terms of both existing and the facilities that are there, but also maintaining all of those buildings, the things in that cyclists end up cycling within. And I think it's key that we make going forward and make sure that funding is available for such measures. You can actually, there is an online on our website, there's basically an online tool where you can actually report those, and the people will go out and have a look at them to make sure whether we can actually do anything about it. So I do recommend you do that. In terms of and I'll also take on board the bit about consultation when we're coming forward for any future schemes going forward. Yeah, definitely.
Good, thank you. Councillor Ray.
Thank you, Chairman. Just three quick points. First of all, I really welcome the idea of segregating cyclists and pedestrians. I speak as a pedestrian and a non-cyclist. And given the choice between walking down the main street on the footpath or through the park where there's cyclists and pedestrians sharing the area, I would choose to walk alongside the road. The idea of working with schools, I think, is a good one, but I think education of a lot of cyclists is needed, and the fact that the rules of the road apply to them just as well as it does to anybody else. And I speak quite strongly about this, having had a couple of incidents on the way here this evening with a cyclist who thought it was fine just to wander into the middle of the road now and again. The connectivity issue is one that's close to my heart. We've challenged this quite a lot in our local area when they've been building new housing estates. And one of the problems seems to have when you have adjoining developers, they don't want to communicate, they're reluctant to produce connectivity between the two estates, be that for cycling or pedestrians. And the space is there, it's been left, but it's never then utilised properly. And also a certain reluctance of residents who live alongside the connection areas because they feel that it's going to be open to abuse. And I think that if you've got children who want to visit their friends on the next estate, it's much safer for them to go down a little alleyway or jitty than it is to go down round along Main Road and back again. So I really welcome the idea of the push for planning to include those connectivity issues. So, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I've already noted for myself, it's the context of design layouts of new developments, and you're quite right that we perhaps need some more confirmation from planning officers that there's an overall design brief across where it's a large scale development where you might have 5 or 6 developers or house builders building different schemes within the same overall development, a more defined design brief of road and path layouts, really just to take into account of what you're talking about. And it's I think the general design layout of housing developments is something that perhaps we could have explored more. Unfortunately, Mr. Pegram's not with us this evening, otherwise we could have probably explored that in more detail. So that's probably one of the reasons why we maybe need to bring this back to a future meeting so that we can explore that in more detail. I don't know if any of the officers are able, I know we're aware that the sort of section 278, section 106 agreements, I don't know whether any officers can help us. I know none of them haven't got any dedicated planning officers as such, in terms of ensuring, or not ensuring, enabling cycle paths on other roads rather than just the new housing developments. But the problem is that in this country, in general, our roads are pretty constrained and narrow. Melton Road has been cited as an example where it has been possible to put in some lane markings for cyclists, but I think in general it's a difficult thing to achieve because generally our roads are pretty narrow. So I suppose it's an open question. I don't know whether Mr. Hayden or in fact whether Sean Parks can help. Is there something more that as a planning authority we could achieve, because we are constrained to a certain extent in what's viable? How far can you go in making demands on developers? That's the problem. If you're able to help,
I would say somebody a conversation we can have. I don't know whether when for example, with Claire is off or DFT has offered the training for officers in terms of the LTM 120 standards, sorry, the cycling design standards, then obviously the places are limited, but it might be worthwhile. Our development control officers will be part of that, definitely, when we try and get it set one up. And maybe try and get the district involved as well, you know, even if it's just one person that comes along, and then you can do it through your other planning connections. It's just spreading that knowledge wider. Obviously, you can deliver those improvements and secure funding to deliver improvements on the wider network, but obviously you're limited to a proportionate amount of money you can take from developers. It's obviously proportionate to the actual size of the scale of the development. So, and Andrew will be much better placed to explain this than me, but there is obviously potential there.
Could you put your microphone on, because the live stream won't hear you?
I was going to say, I think part of the issue is when you've got lots of developers involved, and make sure they work together and do what they're supposed to do as part of their plan permission. They tend to leave those cycle paths till last, and maybe they're then forgotten, but they really need to make sure they are done and that they join up coherently. That's a very important task, because things are much more useful if they join up rather than just got isolated fragments.
Right, thank you. Are there any other comments or contributions or questions?
Yeah.
Councillor Butler.
Reference was made to the design guides and standards, and the comment was especially for short journeys in urban areas, which I think everyone understands. But I don't know what the answer is to this, but of course you've got to bear in mind that Rushcliffe in particular is very rural, and how realistic is it that if we wanted to get people out of the cars and onto bicycles, especially for work or commuting purposes, even if you've got your lanes like the ones we've got on Melton Road and at Walton, which is relatively near the main employment areas, so Nottingham in other words, I mean, I just don't know how we're going to get the message across and encourage people who say live way out at East Leek Way or way out in the Vale of Beaver. They're not going to ride there. They're just not going to be able to. Well, they might be able to, but they won't be able to do a day's work after they cycle all the way in because they'll be worn out.
I think
but it's a serious point though, because when councils are working out their various policies, how do we differentiate between the needs of the urban users and the needs of the rural?
I think the particular emphasis in the current government policy of the Gear Change Report is urban areas, making cycling and walking default trips there. There's a lot of scope for that. And especially we've got, Westbridge becoming so large now with all the new housing areas and other settlements. Yes, I know there's a great problem if you look at the whole wider hinterland of Rushcliffe and more remote settlements. But at least if you concentrate on those, and the larger settlements I know are growing rapidly, Radcliffe and Ronwich and so on as well, there's quite a lot being done there internally, and especially for the places within commuting distance of Nottingham, like Ruddington and Radcliffe are, by having good connections there, you can do quite a lot. Even it's harder for the remoter settlements. But as I said in my talk, the situation is changing, not least of all because of the growing use of e-bikes. And e-bikes, which are becoming more popular in this country, like in many continental countries, do mean you can much more easily do longer trips. Now, many people wouldn't think of cycling more than 2 or 3 miles, say, on a bike, but 5 up to 10 miles on an e-bike, even in quite hilly terrain, becomes much more viable. Okay, you still want to avoid being intimidated by traffic, but we've got to think about those sort of changes will encourage more people to cycle in future, and other people who might give up cycling in the older age to keep cycling with that assistance they can now more easily get hold of.
Could I just come on that as well? Because I was going to mention e-bikes, and that does increase the range, the distance that people could comfortably cover. But it's not going to be the case that everyone's going to be able to cycle in that distance for every journey. So I guess that's where making sure you've got good connectivity to public transport comes into play, and making sure there's other ways that people can get in. If you can travel actively to your station or to your bus stop, and then take a different route from there. But then I think for rural areas, we've got a lot of national cycle network in rural areas, and that's often where people are looking for leisure routes, and that can be a great draw in terms of the tourism economy as well, to have these kind of 50-mile routes or whatever that people want to do of a weekend. But yeah, absolutely take your point that people aren't going to be able to cycle every journey from every destination. And that's why shifting those shorter journeys and those urban journeys, so you're relieving the road for people that do really need to travel by car, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, very briefly.
Yeah, it's just to add to what Claire's saying, to echo it slightly. Effectively, the strategy we have recognises the difference between the urban and the rural, and it's exactly that. It's integrating then cycling journeys into the longer distance journeys, so that there is the cycle or secure cycle parking at train stations or at bus interchanges and the like. But also our local cycle walking infrastructure plan particularly looks at those areas, different areas, because they have such different needs. So, for example, in the more rural hinterlands, it is more about the leisure and the tourism aspects of it, and enhancing that visitor economy potentially, rather than just a commute into a town centre or what have you.
Righty-ho. Okay. Look, I think we've been hit with so much information. I'm not sure that we can come up with any meaningful recommendations really that we can glean from all that, however many slides we had in total. I think that perhaps the best thing would be is that if those slides could be circulated to members of the group, and perhaps we can try and digest them more at our leisure, and we bring it back to a future scrutiny group meeting where we can also have the benefit of a planning officer's more detailed and focused information in terms of planning future housing developments, etc., etc. Because I think we're struggling a bit to have that sort of focused planning input at the moment. So I mean, that's my sort of gut instinct. I don't know if that sort of generally gels with agreement that basically we digest the slides and we bring it back to a future scrutiny group with the planning context, so that we can hopefully formulate some more meaningful recommendations. Does that make sense? Do I get any nods? Anybody shaking their head? Yeah, so I think really that's the sense of what we should be doing. Is that okay? So I think we'll do that, and we'll leave it there for now. And if I can thank our three contributors very much for coming and giving us their presentations, which is much appreciated. And then we will come back at a future meeting, whether it's the next one or the one after that or the one after that, whichever. Okay, so with that, I think we'll call it a day or call it an evening, one or the other. Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. That's why we have vice chairman, so to keep us in order. So I'll move very quickly on to item 6, which is the work programme. Is there any comments you want to make?
No, I think it probably explains itself really. So we've got 2 items for the October meeting, which is a COVID-19 business recovery update, which Al and colleagues from the economic growth team will be providing. And then we've got the community infrastructure levy update, which I assume will be Andrew or potentially Philip Marshall. And then we've only got 1 item for January, which is where we could add the cycling planning focus discussion.
Fine, lovely. Okay. Right, so with that, I will declare the meeting closed and wish you all a safe journey home, whether you're driving or cycling or walking.
Watch out for the bridge.
But don't go over the bridge because it's not there. Thanks very much.